There was a relatively popular game on Habbo, a proto-Roblox of the 2000s, called The Sims, and it was really simple. Two families were plopped into a room, each with their own plot of land. Each family took turns rolling the dice, doing various things. They could obtain new furniture to decorate their homes, expand the size of their land, and have a baby, bringing a new member to the family. The game, when played, seems like pure, innocuous fun. Players would start assigning themselves roles in the family, like mum, dad, and sister. Families would bond over moments of joy, like winning a jackpot of furniture in their lucky visit to the casino. And they also shared more somber moments, like grieving the untimely demise of a beloved family relative. But unlike the game it was based on, this version of The Sims had a twist. There was a way to win this game, and the way to win was to be the last player standing. You see where I'm going with this, don't you? If you've ever played The Sims on Habbo, chances are this never really struck you as odd. In the same way how most people don't think of the moral implications of the death penalty when they play Hangman, Habbo players don't think too much about the morality of kidnapping their neighbours when they play The Sims. But to understand how we got here, a bit of context is in order. The most important thing to understand about Habbo is that credits, the game's virtual currency, is everything. Your entire gameplay experience will hinge on whether you have credits or not, something that costs real-life money to buy. Because with credits, you could buy furniture to decorate your rooms, new clothing for your avatar, and Habbo Club membership to stand out from the poor. By the mid-2000s though, there were signs that Habbo's players were maybe developing a system of social apartheid, sometimes literally enforcing segregation among the classes by creating Habbo Club only venues that kicked out the povos. Forums were soon filled with complaints by poorer players of being profiled by stores based on their clothing, as well as richer players over the sheer entitlement of the poor, who deserved to be discriminated against because they were scum who contributed nothing to the game other than being vermin filth. Not all wealthy players had this view though. With the vast majority of players being those who didn't buy credits, some wealthy players recognised the need to interact with people outside of their class to have fun in the game. So, how do you have fun with the poor? One way was to host bread and circuses. After all, what's more fun than watching a desperate group of Habbos, fight over a virtual pot of money with a gauntlet of fun and exciting games? And some of these games have become iconic staples of the hotel. Falling Fernie was a game akin to musical chairs. The host would place down chairs in a room and players would rush to sit on them. Ultimately, a game of skill, each round eliminated a single player, with the process repeating until there was one winner left. To heighten the tension every round, when there were 3 players left, they would form a triangle around the tile where the host would place down the next chair. The tension was turned up when there were 2 players left. They'd form a single space, similar to a try, and then fight to the death with a best of 3 series. Not all games were raw tests of skill like Falling Fernie though. Some games conferred distinct advantages to certain types of players, the wealthy. One of these was Cozy Change. The goal of this game was to change one's clothing based on a theme provided by the host, for example Disney or celebrity. Every round, the player with the worst outfit, as determined by the host, was eliminated from the game. As mentioned previously, wealthier players with Habbo Club membership had access to more clothing choices, which often meant they stood out from the drab, uninspired outfits worn by their povo counterparts. Recognising this inequality, some hosts made the game fairer by reimposing segregation and banning the poor from participating entirely. In a similar vein to Cozy Change was another popular game called Kick the Ugly, an actual game where players were split into 2 teams based on gender, NBs, who took turns to collectively vote on who the ugliest player was on the other team. The host would announce G to UB, girls to ugly boys, and the girls would line up on who they thought the ugliest boy was. The host would then announce B to UG, boys to ugly girls, and the process repeated until there were 2 players left. Habbo Wiki makes the unsourced claim that the game could also be played with P2S and Rev enabled. If true, this meant that, in some instances, the player voted the ugliest by the other team could simply pay the host money to survive another round. Or, if they paid even more, they could get their revenge and have one of their opponents declared the ugliest instead. An act I think pretty much epitomizes everything that Habbo was about. But I digressed long enough. Let's talk about The Sims. 2 families, the Montagues and the Capulets, not what they're actually called but might as well be, fight to the death until one of their descendants emerge as the winner. Taking turns rolling the dice, various actions can happen to a family, including gaining and losing furniture, gaining and losing relatives, stealing land at the expense of neighbours, household arson, abduction of elderly relatives, and other wildcard events concocted by the host's imagination. If you've ever played this game though, you'll quickly come to 2 realizations. First realization: furniture is completely useless in this game. Nothing in the rules incentivizes having a bed, a fridge, or a sink. It doesn't give you any buffs, like increasing the number of players you have in your house, or giving you better dice roll outcomes owing to an improved quality of life. In fact, furniture is arguably worse than useless. Depending on the variation being played, a household can actually lose the game if they end up getting suffocated by their own furniture. So a family that has been parading their successes by lavishly decorating their house with frivolous goods can, in just a few turns, be crushed by their own hubris. Second realization: the only thing that matters in this game is that people die. It doesn't matter who, your neighbours or your relatives, and it doesn't matter how, bad dice roll, suffocation, assassination, all that matters is that they die except for you. The reason for this comes down to the game's Anschluss mechanic. When a family fully annexes the land of another, they completely wipe out that family. But once that happens, the territorial boundaries reset, with half of the victorious family taking over their former neighbour's home, sparking a brand new intrafamilial civil war. So, if you think about it, the most optimal way to play is to have as little furniture in your house as possible, and have as few family members as possible, ideally being the sole survivor when you deliver the coup de grace against your insufferable neighbours. Playing this way, however, requires 2 things. 1, that you get lucky dice rolls, which you can't control, and 2, that you play like a complete sociopath. Which would be fine and all if Habbo's players were rational actors, capable of independent forms of thought. Unfortunately, Habbo's players aren't rational. Because of the way the game is advertised, The Sims attracts a lot of players who want to roleplay. They want to raise a family, decorate their studios, and share bunnies and ice cream with their children. Being a calculating, rational actor, demanding that your household only be furnished with 1x1 pieces of furniture to minimise the chances of being crushed to death by a marauding horde of neighbours, completely breaks that immersion. And so you, my non-self-projected viewer, can't act like the sociopath that you always wanted to be, because you need your family members on side. You are likely to die in this game, and to maximise the chances of being reborn as a new baby, you need to play this game as if you're not trying to fight for the illustrious pot of prizes at the end. You need to mask and present yourself as the idyllic house husband, one that doesn't celebrate the death of his own child because it reduces the number of players you have to compete with in the upcoming civil war. Hi, editing me here. I just wanted to add 2 additional points. Firstly, the popularity of The Sims likely coincided with the popularity of adoption centres on Habbo, whereby players would either roleplay as prospective children wanting to be adopted, or as adults wanting to become parents. This type of roleplay sometimes led to the creation of caring, loving families, but that wasn't always the case. That brings me on to my second point, which is the suggestion that you couldn't roleplay the role of a sociopathic husband. We have enough evidence to suggest that players did, in fact, roleplay as entirely dysfunctional families, with kids engaging in destructive antisocial behaviour and parents beating up their children. But I wouldn't say, based on my own recollection anyway, that this was remotely the norm, either in adoption centres or The Sims. The game that I've been using to illustrate my points was one held in Habbo Origins, an old school version of the game only for adults. Adults who, presumably having played this game 20 years ago, would have been long accustomed to the traditions and customs of infanticide as demanded by the game, and so they wouldn't necessarily react in the same way as a child would playing the same game. This absurd tension between what players wanted to roleplay versus what the game actually incentivized inevitably led to changes being introduced by future hosts. One common change was to change the game's win conditions to be the last family standing rather than the last player standing. Hosts still had to be careful when designing the prize structure though. If, at the end, every surviving member received the same prize, there was an incentive for a family to win together. If, however, the prize pot was fixed, and all winning as a family did was distribute the pot among its surviving inhabitants, then you've reintroduced that scheming matricidal relatives problem all over again. Perhaps the best rework I've seen that still preserved the character of the original game was one showcased by the streamer DM Avenger. In this game, the goal was for a family to accumulate as many pieces of furniture as possible in 6 rounds. Families couldn't annex each other's lands, as their plots were physically separated, but could nevertheless steal furniture from each other and kidnap their relatives. To incentivize kidnapping, the game had a tiebreaker mechanism, whereby if 2 families had the same number of furniture at the end, the family with the most members won the game. Additionally, the number of prizes available scaled up with the number of family members one had, incentivizing larger families overall. But some hosts took adapting The Sims in a different direction. One such adaptation involved combining it with another game, Monopoly. In this version, players not only rolled the dice for random events, but for money as well, as each player was assigned a random job at the start of the game. Money, which families pooled together, could be used to buy things like furniture, which actually gave out buffs, food to satiate hunger, and medicine to cure illness. More importantly, a family could also buy the shops themselves, which sold those pieces of furniture, food, and medicine. If a family bought a shop, they received all of the revenues generated by it. Thus, if a family owned a pharmacy, any other family that wished to buy medicine would pay them directly instead of an NPC. So how did a family win this game? Was it by accumulating the most money within a certain number of rounds? Nope. It was by being the last family standing. Unlike the original Sims though, you couldn't annex your neighbour's land. To win, you needed to make your neighbours' lives as miserable as possible. Owning a shop didn't just confer the profits from it, it also conferred the right to exercise control. A shop-owning family could hire and fire workers at will, allowing them to sack employees who worked for rival families and stack it with their relatives. A shop-owning family could also deny sales entirely, refusing to sell items to a certain family. With this level of control, families could try to build a monopoly of shops to shut the others out of the game. If, for instance, a family managed to buy both the grocery store and the cafe, the 2 shops that sold food in this game, they could essentially starve out the other families by simply denying the sale of all food in the game. Pursuing this strategy always had its risks though. For one, the prices were scaled so that buying even one shop took an inordinate amount of money. If it became clear that a family was trying to establish a monopoly on food, the other families would scramble to try and deny that monopoly by buying the second store. And even if a family did succeed, it would inevitably lead to retaliation. Other families would quickly close their stores to the aggressor family, potentially shutting off medicine, furniture, and other supplies. Any families that controlled high-income businesses, particularly the bank, could flood the game with money, paying NPC criminals to burn down their stores, NPC assassins to murder their relatives, and NPC police officers to arrest them for false charges. Also, to be clear, while there was a police station, you couldn't actually buy it. In effect then, families either had to wait it out, hoping that their rivals would die out on their own, or they had to work together to form an oligopoly to shut one, maybe two families out of the game. This game took forever. There was way too much dice rolling to do, way too much sitting around and doing nothing, and way too many errands to do as players spent most of their time buying groceries and commuting to work. And I know this because guess who wasted hours of his life playtesting this absolutely miserable excuse of a game, watching his family members slowly end their existence as they left out of sheer boredom, watching the other family members circle around him like vultures, conspiring to starve the remnants of his family out of the game. That's right, not me, because I was the one hosting this game as its inventor. The best thing about The Sims, regardless of the variation played, is that if you endure all of that pain and suffering and finally win, you get to receive the juicy pot of prizes at the end. That is, of course, unless the entire game was a scam, in which case you've done all of that for nothing.